Have you ever wondered whether our modern playoff system is really better than old-time pennant races? Well, this story will tell you how I feel about it. Before the 1922 season started, the New York Yankees looked absolutely unstoppable. Now, I don't need to even tell you about Babe Ruth and his 54 home runs in 1920 and his 59 in 1921. The Yankees really had a great club, and they seemed to be on the verge of a long American League pennant dynasty. However, for reasons that still strike me as bizarre, Babe was suspended because of off-season barnstorming. He was out for the first 6 weeks of the 1922 season. Ruth missed the first 33 games of the 1922 season. The first game he played was in New York against the St. Louis Browns on May 20th, 1922. That was in front of 38,000 rabid fans at the Polo Grounds. Now, the Yankees weren't exactly awful without him. New York went 22-11 without Babe Ruth and were 2 games ahead of the surprising Browns, who were 19-12 on that day. You might have heard about the 1922 St. Louis Browns. If you're a fan of APA and other baseball sims, you certainly have heard of them. J. Richard Sides made the 1922 Browns back in 1954 in his 4th batch of greatest teams of the past. Now, thanks in large part to Sides, the 1922 Browns became somewhat of a legend among baseball sim players right from that beginning. The combination of George Sisler's .420 batting average, the 155 runs Ken Williams drove in, and former Yankee pitcher Urban Shocker, who went 24-17, made the Browns an absolutely formidable side. And in fact, it was Shocker that Ruth and the Yankees faced on May 20th, and it was Shocker that won that game. The Big Bambino went 0-for-4 with a strikeout and didn't hit the ball out of the infield. On and on the season went. The Browns went ahead at times, the Yankees went ahead at other times. Both teams were clearly on a collision course with each other, and that collision finally happened in late September in St. Louis. The 3-game series in St. Louis between the Yankees and Browns was nothing short of spectacular. It was, without a question, the all-time highlight of St. Louis Browns baseball. But we need to set the stage first. St. Louis had never won an American League pennant to that point. St. Louis had also never won a National League pennant. The old St. Louis Brown Stockings won the American Association pennant in 1885, 1886, 1887, and 1888. The St. Louis Maroons won the Union Association back in 1884, if you consider that a major league, that is. And that was it. The only St. Louis pennants were in defunct leagues, and it had been 34 years since the last one. Now, the one constant in St. Louis, well, that was Sportsman's Park. Sportsman's Park had been the site of local professional baseball going back to 1875 and had been in use as a baseball stadium even longer than that. Now, according to contemporary newspapers, Sportsman's Park seated just a hair over 20,000 back in 1922. But they managed to cram in over 30,000 fans for each game of this 3-game series by setting up ropes in the outfield for overflow seating. The games began at 3 p.m. I want to emphasize that we tend to think that games back in the days before lights all started around 1, and it's not true. These games all began at 3 p.m. They began later to accommodate fans who worked during the day. The gates at the park opened up at 12:30 p.m. and the park was full by 1 p.m. for each of the 3 games. Some fans had lined up for tickets as early as 6 in the morning. And the fans there for that first one really saw a classic. New York was up 2-1 in the late innings of the first game on September 16th. Urban Shocker, again the former Yankee, came up with a runner on second base and 1 out late in the ballgame. But instead of pinch hitting for him, the Browns stuck with Shocker, and he struck out looking, ending the rally. There was a major controversy at the end of that game. Right fielder Whitey Witt of the Yankees was hit by a soda bottle that was thrown from the crowd. There was a $500 award proposed for anybody who named the assailant. It was later up to $2,000, but no guilty party was ever caught. According to the Sabre recap of this game, the New York Times eventually reported that some St. Louis salesman claimed that Witt had stepped on a bottle that was already in the outfield, propelling it up in the air and hitting himself in the forehead in comical fashion. As you can imagine, things were really different in the age before television, but that's the story that Ban Johnson apparently went with. They apparently banned the sale of bottled beverages the rest of the games in this series, though it didn't have much of an effect. Now, the second game, the game on September 17th, was another classic. This was a scoreless tie going into the top of the 6th inning when Babe Ruth came up. Now, Ruth usually had trouble with Browns starter Hub Pruitt and his screwball, but this time he didn't. He blasted one high over the right field wall onto Grand Boulevard, making it 1-0 Yankees. But that was it for the Bronx Bombers. St. Louis relied on a bevy of singles in the bottom of the 6th and a big home run by Ken Williams in the bottom of the 8th inning, scoring 5 runs in all. Browns won this one 5-1. And now the Browns were within a half game of first place with the rubber match awaiting. The game on Monday, September 18th was the best of the 3, and yet it's been largely forgotten. None of the big stars did much. Ruth went 0 for 4 with a strikeout. George Sisler also went 0 for 4. But this game had the pressure and intensity of a World Series game. Or, as we would say today, it had an October feel to it. The Browns finally broke the scoreless deadlock against Yankees starter Bullet Joe Bush in the bottom of the 5th, relying on a ground rule double, a single, and then a sacrifice fly. Now, ground rule doubles were abundant for the Browns in all 3 of these games thanks to the partisan contingent in front of the outfield walls. 2 more so-called St. Louis doubles helped the Browns score again in the bottom of the 7th, but then disaster struck in the top of the 8th. Dixie Davis, the Browns' starting pitcher who's been long forgotten, faced Wally Pipp with a runner on second base and 2 men out. Davis had been masterful. He'd given up only 3 hits so far, one of which was currently perched on second base. Wally Pipp lined the ball straight back to Davis, hitting his glove. The deflected ball went over to second baseman Marty McManus, who grabbed it and made a desperation toss to first base. But it was off target and ended up going into the Yankees' dugout. That allowed the run to score, making it now 2-1 Browns. And that's the way it stood until the top of the 9th inning. Now, we'd go for a closer in this situation today. You really don't need me to tell you that. Of course, this was 1922. Nobody was even interested in relief pitching back then, not unless things were desperate. And so Davis was in there and faced Wally Sheng, the catcher, who drove a single off of his glove for only the 5th New York hit of the afternoon. It's the second ball hit off of his glove, and that brought up Elmer Smith, a pinch hitter for second baseman Aaron Ward. Smith had spent most of his season with the last-place Red Sox. He was also a left-handed hitter. Dixie Davis was a right-handed pitcher. Now, St. Louis manager Lee Full wanted to try to get Smith out of the game. He made a move that seems sort of bizarre in retrospect. Davis threw one pitch to Smith. It got away from the catcher. It was later ruled to be a pass ball, though the official accounts of the game really aren't all that clear. And that's when Full made his move with a 1-0 count on Smith and with the runner now on second base. He lifted Davis for Hub Pruitt, who had thrown a complete game the day before. Pruitt, of course, was a left-handed pitcher. Now, this prompted Yankees manager Miller Huggins to remove Elmer Smith, the pinch hitter, for another pinch hitter, this time right-handed hitting Mike McNally. That's right, there were 2 pinch hitters in the same plate appearance, a true rarity. Then what did McNally do? He bunted. I'm not making this up. All of that strategy, all of that platooning led to a bunt. A bunt that Smith certainly could have laid down. Now, Browns catcher Hank Severide, who had just been charged with that pass ball that got the Yankees back in the ballgame, made a split-second decision on this bunt. He decided to try to throw Yankees catcher Wally Sheng out at third base. Remember, Sheng was on second because of the pass ball. It's not an awful thought, honestly. I don't think that Sheng was a great runner, being a catcher and all. Severide probably had a realistic chance at getting him, but the throw was late. Now there were runners on first and third with nobody out, and up came Everett Scott, the Yankee shortstop, the number 8 hitter, and he walked on 4 pitches. Now it seems from the play-by-play accounts that the walk was unintentional, and I really think that's true because that was it for Pruitt. They took him out right afterwards. The next pitcher, none other than Urban Shocker, the former Yankees hurler who had fought valiantly but lost in that 2-1 game in Game 1. Up came Bullet Joe Bush, the New York Yankee pitcher. Remember, the Yankees hadn't scored yet. There were no outs now in the top of the ninth, and they were trailing 2-1 in a game that had huge implications for the pennant, but they still let the pitcher hit for himself. Bush hit another ground ball over to McManus. Of course it was to McManus. Marty threw to the plate just in time to force out Wally Shang, and the bases now remained loaded with one man out. And as if somebody in Hollywood had written this, the next batter was Whitey Witt. Witt's head was still bandaged from the pop bottle incident just 2 days earlier, but it didn't deter him in the slightest. He hit a line drive single to center field, scoring 2 runs. And never mind the fact that Joe Dugan, the next hitter, then grounded into a double play. The damage had been done. New York led 3-2. The Browns had the heart of the order coming up in the bottom of the ninth. George Sisler, Ken Williams, and Baby Doll Jacobson were like an early version of Murderer's Row back in those days. But they did nothing, and that was it. The Browns won 6 and lost 3 in their remaining 9 games. The Yankees had 10 games left, winning 6 and losing 4. And in the end, the Yankees won the pennant by a single game. They clinched it on September 30th, the day before the final game of the season in Boston. Of course they clinched it in Boston. The Browns never had another season like that one in St. Louis. They did win the American League pennant in 1944, beating out the Detroit Tigers by a single game. But of course it wasn't quite the same since so many star players were out of the major leagues in the military at the time. The St. Louis Browns never finished higher than 3rd in any of the rest of their seasons in St. Louis. This team, which was clearly the talk of the town in 1922, ended up taking a back seat to the far more successful St. Louis Cardinals. Eventually, the franchise received permission to move to Baltimore. But how does this compare to our version of October? Now, it's really hard to sum up an entire pennant race in a single video. Pennant races aren't about a single series in September. They're about the long haul. They're about games played in April and May just as much as they are about those tense games played in late September. When the race has been won early, there's not too much left to cheer about. That doesn't go over so well when the focus is on advertising revenue and on viewership. And yet there was always something magical about it when you got a good race. There was something special about following the out-of-town scoreboard, hoping that the other team slipped up. There certainly was something special about those magical late September series that attracted huge crowds and showed people just what the sport was capable of. Now you guys can have all of the playoffs and all the October that you want. For me, I prefer to stick with the old style pennant races.